Hi, welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. I'm Khanh-Duc, instructor at the University of Siegen in Germany. Today's session is about how to engage our learners and promote learning through the use of effective questions in our classrooms. Let's begin. We're going to talk about engaging students and promoting learning in our classrooms through the use of questions and essentially through effective questions. This is what we'll be covering today. So first of all, we're going to look at classroom questions, what kind of questions there are, what kind of questions we use in the classroom. And then we're going to look at how to use questions effectively. So not just questions, but how to use them in a way that work for us and for our learners. And then we're going to look at why questions go wrong. You're familiar with cases where you ask questions and you get no responses, or you ask questions and end up having to ask more questions. So we look at pitfalls in questionings. And then last but not least, we're going to put it all together and see what you can take away from it. So let's begin. We have three types of questions in the English language structurally. First of all, we're all familiar with the yes and no questions, where our students can only answer either yes or no. We've got examples here. For instance, are you listening? Student responds yes or no, or doesn't respond. And second question is, does the Smith family live in London? Maybe a question that you ask after you've done your reading. The second type of question, which is also quite restrictive in their answers, are the or questions, otherwise known as the choice questions. You could ask your class if you want to give them autonomy in what, in some of the classroom decision making. You could ask them, should we do the listening or the reading first? Your learners, your students have to answer with one of those two choices. If you've done a reading or a listening comprehension task, you could have a question like this: does John have a brother or a sister? And here your learner again is quite constrained with what they could answer. The choices are there for them already to choose from. You're familiar with the other type of question, which is the WH, or also known as the open question. As a real authentic classroom question, you could have, give your students a choice in when to do a vocabulary test, for example, and you could say something like, when should we do the test? You could also ask your students an open question based, again, on something they've done in class, some work they've done in class. For example, how many children do Mr. and Mrs. Smith have? Now, we can also classify questions by looking from a different angle. So not from the perspective of the structure of the question, but by looking at what we want to achieve with the question. So remember, this session is about using questions effectively. It's about engaging students, promoting learning. So we need to look at questions from a different angle. And the first kind of questions that we can look at is authentic questions. Now, these questions are common in every stage of our lesson, and we consider them real questions because these questions simulate everyday life. For instance, when we ask, how long did you take on your homework? Or if you've got a student who's missing in your class, you would say something like, oh, does anyone know where Lucas is? In authentic questions, we as a teacher are interested in the message contained in the answer that the students give us. And it's not just us who be interested in the answer, but perhaps the other members of the classroom. Okay. And what is being said, what your students answer, is new to you. You don't know how long they took on their homework. You don't know where the absent student is. And the answers that your students give you add to our understanding. And these are real questions because we ask questions like this all the time in our daily life. We ask questions to get new information. Okay. So we have then the questions to sum up. Authentic questions, we don't know the answer beforehand. For example, can we start now? You don't know. If you can start now, I mentioned the missing student. Does anyone know where Lucas is? Or how long did you take on your homework? These are common in all stages of the lesson. The next type of question are the check questions. And check questions, while common during actual teaching phases, they allow your students to show you what they know or don't know. Okay, so your students demonstrate their knowledge. You use it primarily when you're checking answers to tasks or exercises. For example, after reading comprehension, you could ask vocabulary questions. What's the synonym for doctor, for instance, right? Or you have in checking homework, perhaps what's the answer to number 4? And when we use these questions, we're hoping to find out if our learners know the answer, if something has been understood or needs further clarification. And we tend to use these types of questions actually more frequently than the authentic questions. And the third way of checking knowledge, especially grammar or vocabulary, is by asking a series of questions that help your students grasp the meaning of something. They're similar to check questions, but they're used mainly to determine understanding of grammar and vocabulary. You ask these questions to guide your learners, and at all stages of the questioning, we as teachers then can determine if we need to give more explanations, if we need to stop and go back. And what's important here is that with concept questions, we actually ask a series of questions so that at every step of the way, we can be sure that our learners are following, and we can always stop and backtrack if we find that they've lost their way. Here's an example. You've defined a library to your students. You've explained to them what a library is, and we summarize this in one sentence. A library is a place where you can borrow books. So you ask now your series of concept questions to check if they've understood what you've just said. So you could begin by saying, do we have to pay for each book? So here the answer is restricted. They say either yes or no. Then you ask them, can you keep the book forever? Again, they say yes or no. So these are the key aspects of what a library is. And then you could then ask them if they've answered, do we have to pay for each book? And they go, no. Can we keep the book forever? No. Then you can say, now tell me, what's the difference between a library and a bookshop? And here, there you go. You've checked knowledge of the new vocabulary. Now, have you thought about why we ask so many questions in class? Some research has indicated that up to 80% of our language in class is based around questions. Next time you're in class, try and mentally make a note of the types of structures you use. You'll see that it's actually true that questions are central to classroom life. Without questions, there will be no interaction, no two-way communication, and no way for us teachers to find out anything about our learners, either real information or, checking knowledge or understanding. And because questions are so important in our classrooms, we need to make sure that we use questions well. And this is what this session is all about. Here are 5 of my favorite tips, and we'll be looking at them together in the next couple of slides. First tip, look for learning. don't just chase correct answers. I'll tell you more about that in the next slide. Use a sequence of questions to guide your learners. Ask questions that lead to learning and discovery. And consider also how open your questions are. How much answers can your learners give you? How much can they demonstrate of their knowledge of English, of their ability to use English? And last tip, very important tip, avoid hypothetical questions. Because if you can't answer them, your learners can't answer them either. So, first tip, look for learning. As I said in the previous slide, don't just be on the chase for right answers. I know it's easy and it looks great. We feel great when we ask a question and we always get the right answer. We always have the same couple of students who answer the question. But do bear in mind that this isn't as good as it looks. Let me demonstrate. Let's look at this scenario. You ask a question. You have your interested and your stronger students who will quickly put up their hands and answer your question. You call on these strong students. You call on the students that you feel will answer the questions correctly, just because that's easy. The student who's called upon answers the question, answers correctly, feels motivated, and stays interested. And that cycle continues. But what about the ones who didn't contribute? Have you thought about that? Could it be that they did not have the answer? Now, if we keep following this cycle, you'll end up with the stronger ones feeling good about themselves, but the weaker ones not improving and actually feeling quite demotivated. Those who answer show you that for them, the learning has happened. But you also need to be there for those where the learning is still happening, for the slower ones. So how can we move this learning along? Okay, so I mentioned in the previous slide that learning is still happening. And what we want to do is we want to move learning along, and we can do this through our questions. We need to move our learners towards learning. So use check questions. Those closed questions that I mentioned earlier that take them step by step to discovery. Check questions or concept questions. Okay, and other tips include nominating individual students, but remember to include all your students. So not the ones who were the first to volunteer, and don't choose the same students all the time. I know it's easy, it moves the lesson along, but it doesn't actually move the lesson for everyone. Wait also until you've got a number of students who are ready to provide answers. Do not nominate the very first volunteer. Next thing is to use a sequence of questions. You begin by focusing your learners on an example, or ask them a question and elicits an answer from your learners. Okay, if you've presented a sentence, ask them to copy it down, ask them to read it. Then ask a question that draws your learners' attention to some aspect of the language or the usage, and make them think about it. The question you ask should also require them to remember what they had previously learned. So you're going here on a cycle. So your strong ones may come to the answer faster. Your weaker ones will have the time to kind of look in their head, look back on their learning, to kind of revise. Listen to your learners' responses. And what you have to remember is that you want all your learners, all your students to make the discovery. You're not chasing correct answers. You're not there only for the strong ones, no matter how easy it is. And you give feedback by clarifying, Maybe something's not been understood, so you clarify, you echo, you write it up on the board, you correct them where they've gone wrong, and you summarize their responses so that everyone is involved in the learning and discovery process. You ask questions, like I said in the previous slide, that lead to learning and discovery. So you've got your sequence, you've got your sentence, you've got your example. But how do such questions look like? Again, we're not chasing just the right answers. So you lead them through a sequence of concept and check questions. You ask questions to find out what your learners already know. You ask questions to remind them of what they already know. We've got two examples here. If you were doing new tenses, you could say, what tenses do we use with these time phrases? Perhaps you've got, your time phrases like last week, yesterday, in 1975. So check that with them. If you're doing present simple, you can say, what words do we use to talk about how often people do things? So they could come up, what you'd be expecting them to tell you would be adverbials like always, every day, once a week. Then you ask questions to focus on new information to guide them along. And then you ask a series of concept questions to lead them step by step to the new information. So we've looked at the type of questions. We looked at what we want to achieve in class through these questions. Now, the other thing we want to look at is how much room our questions leave for our learners to express themselves. If you ask your learners, do you want to do page 21 or 22? Their choices are page 21 and page 22. They don't have a lot of, they don't have to express themselves quite extensively. And an answer like, does Tom have an answer to a question like, does Tom have two brothers or two sisters? Doesn't actually tell you about learning really that has or has not happened. It's just your learner's been so restricted through the question that they cannot really go very wrong. The answer is always 50-50. So let's look at questions, the type of questions we can ask, the degree of openness, and how you can effectively choose questions that allow your learners, that safe space to express themselves and allow stronger learners to provide more answers. The first type of questions are polar closed questions. And these questions offer your learners the possibility of one of two choices. So they're quite restricted. You have the yes/no question that we looked at the beginning of this session. Is there a comma in this sentence? So your learner knows that, well, there should either be a comma or shouldn't be a comma. Okay, so they're quite restricted then their answer. You also have the choice question, again, one of two choices for them to choose from. Does the first example have a comma or the second example? So makes them look at those two examples and pick one of the two. Question for you to think about. When you ask such questions, how do such questions lead to learning and discovery? I'd like you to think about that. We move to the next question that I'd like you to consider as well when deciding to use such questions in the classroom is whether you've got particular learners for whom such questions are best. Would such questions be better for your stronger learners or your not so strong learners who need a little bit more time, who need a little bit more guidance towards language? Then you have the really closed questions, which are about fixed facts and have only one correct answer, or perhaps a limited number of possible answers. If you've done a reading, or if your learners had attended an event the day before, you could ask a question like, what time did the concert start? If it was a concert yesterday, it started at 8 o'clock, the fixed answer you would expect from your learner would be 8 o'clock. If you're talking about the future, using future forms, or if you've again done a reading or listening and you're testing comprehension, you could ask a question like, when is Sam meeting his friends? Again, this question prerequisites a fixed answer. In your setting, can you think of situations where such questions could be used, again, to guide learning, to guide your learners towards discovery? In open questions, there are no single fixed answers. Your learners can answer the questions in a number of different ways. For example, in a reading comprehension or even listening comprehension, or if they're doing a writing task about a child and something's happened in it, child opened the door, you could ask your learners the question, why did the child open the door? Could be various different reasons why that happened. Or you've given them an essay prompt or a discussion prompt. How can we keep fit in the winter months? I'm asking you an open question. When would we use such questions in our class, in our classrooms? At what point in the lesson would we use such questions? Now that we've looked at the three types, the polar questions, the closed questions, and the open questions, I'd like to link that in with the main topic of today's session, which is using these questions effectively. So how can we use these questions effectively? Well, closed questions, first of all, encourage shorter answers. They require very limited language output from your learners. They demonstrate understanding and learning of language. Open questions encourage longer answers. They require your learners to talk about content, to use language to talk about content. So bear that in mind. What these type of questions do, the kind of answers they require, and then you can ask yourself, well, which one's better in my situation? Which type of questions are better for my stronger learners, for my weaker learners? Right? So your open questions demonstrate language in use, whereas your closed questions demonstrate understanding and learning of language. So perhaps for your weaker learners, if you want to guide them, you want to help move learning and discovery, stay with the closed questions until they're confident enough and you can see, okay, they've understood the language and now I'm going to guide them towards using language. Then you move towards open questions. So why do questions go wrong in the classroom? Well, they go wrong when we ask hypothetical questions. Students who don't have the language ability to answer hypothetical questions find it then difficult to say anything that's been asked with a hypothetical question. For example, what would you do if you were president? It's a question that's used commonly in class, when we want to get students to talk, we want to get them to be creative, to use their imagination, but we do have to make sure that they have the structures to talk about this. And sometimes some students have perhaps not even thought about what they would do if they were president. So be very careful when choosing such questions, such scenarios where you want them to be creative and use their imagination. Questions also fail when you ask your learners things that they don't know or they cannot guess. You have to be careful there. You really, really have to be careful there. Sometimes we ask them content questions only to find out that they've not been able to answer us because they've actually not understood us, or they just don't have the answer to that. And that's quite a letdown in class, because it stops the learning and you get to an awkward position where you as a teacher have to backtrack and your students feel embarrassed because they can't answer you. For instance, you've given them a reading about a robbery, and then you ask them the question, you think it's a good question: why did the burglar steal the bananas? Now, the answers are nowhere to be found in the text. And that's just awkward. That just shows lack of preparation in your part. So make sure if you're creating comprehension questions based on a reading or listening, make sure the answers can be found in the text, in the reading, or in the listening, or they may have a good chance of guessing it. Another pitfall is when you ask a question in a question. This is called an embedded question. For instance, do you have an idea? That's your first question. Why the author chose these arguments for their essay? That's your second question. Why did the author choose these arguments? Your first question was, do you have any idea? Now, your learners will automatically try to answer the first question, the indirect question. Do you have any idea? So they might say yes, then you're lucky, and then you can prompt them and say, okay, why did the author choose these arguments? If they say no, they don't have any idea, what you do then? You're quite stuck. So just avoid embedded questions. To conclude, my tips are for effective questioning to foster learning, engage learners. Please do not chase after the correct answers. Vary your questions so that all your learners can discover and share their learning. Use a range of questions for a range of different purposes. Include authentic questions as well as check and concept questions. And avoid the common pitfalls of asking hypothetical questions, embedded questions, or questions that your students can't answer. Before you leave, or after you've left these sessions, I'd like you to think about your own teaching. And here's a question to take away with you. On the basis of this session today, how can you improve your own use of questions in class? It could be anything. It could be, changing the type of questions you ask, or now that you have a greater awareness of our tendency to chase after the right answers, that you take a step back and not chase the right answers, but help your learners on the way to discovery and learning. That's it for our session. If you want to read more, Wiggins and McTighe have a really good book on questions in the classroom called Essential Questions, and otherwise on the BBC English website from the British Council, there's a good article on asking questions in the classroom.